session of probably 8. We'll see how it goes. We may speed up, we may slow down. Just a quick review of where we kind of were. Remember, we were talking about a 14+ foot shroud that goes from the bottom of the feet around the top of the head and back down to the toes, in which the body is to decompose for a year before the bones are then buried in the tomb. Last time we talked about the fact that there isn't a single thing that I can present that there isn't someone saying is wrong, including the fact that even that Jesus was alive. And of course, we took that as a topic to see, is there any documentation for this person called Jesus of Nazareth? And we found a great deal of documentation, and in fact, double the documentation of all the others combined. We tried to get clear in our heads that we're not talking about preferences, beliefs, or the teaching of the faith. We're talking about methods. We're trying to focus on what can science in 4 sessions tell us, what can the historical evidential method teach us in maybe 2 sessions, and what can the quadrilateral method teach us in probably 2 sessions. I told you as of 2016, you may be surprised at that date instead of 2020. But it takes a while for things to get published, for people to respond, to say whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. So let's say as of 2016, we didn't have anything showing up in the 3 methods to suggest that there was a reason not to think of it as genuine. We took our first characteristic of science of the 10 we're going to talk about, and this is the attempt to figure out how do we make mistakes? What kind of biases do we have? And so they start out with the blue ones, which is things that we can count, things that we can observe, and then we try to agree on a description of it. And then finally, the yellow, where we try to interpret what do you think we've actually seen. And the point of doing this is to see if we can keep each other's rose glasses kind of out of the problem. We were making a list as we went of the, shall we say, reasonable kinds of things that we could conclude. I told you the scientists have 100, I think it's 178 right now on their list, that's what they would be expecting anyone to have. Now, this is obviously for a layperson, but the point of it is, if you're going to explain the shroud, or if you're going to try to duplicate the shroud or interpret or whatever, you've got to really deal with all this stuff, because all these things are true of the item that we're looking at with science. So beginning with some new material, we'll now look at the head, and there seem to be blood flows on it, which will be interpreted eventually as thorns. This is the natural face that's on the shroud, and you can see at the top a variety of things that kind of look like flows or blots or something. We know that if you have pain, you will have a response to it that shows up in various muscles in the head. And they're showing you R1, 2, and 3 because they believe that what's happened is that the blood on one particular one is going over those ridges as it moves down across the head. Shown this way, and I'm blinking a dot to show you the seed, they think that something was stuck in a vein which stayed there, which would explain the continued bleeding that went on over time. The crown of thorns being reconstructed in a circular style, and I have one here that I will hold up eventually for you to kind of see. In a regular session, I would hand this around so you could see how sharp they are, but I can't do that tonight. It appears that about 7 thorns would touch the bone and 7 would touch the skin, with the estimate of maybe 30 of them total that are on this particular person. The reason they think 30 is because the Eastern concept of a crown was actually over the head, not the Greek around the head wreath. And the pollen on the shroud leads them to think it's the Syrian Christ thorn that was involved. So here you have on black, I photographed this since I can't hand it around where you could see it, but the picture shows you better probably what it would have looked like. I can imagine the person who wore it didn't like it, and I can imagine the person who made it and put it on someone's head didn't like handling it either. That'd been pretty rough stuff. So we can put onto our list that small injuries around the head bled significantly and for a considerable length of time. There's some marks, and this is what artists apparently looked for ideas up until 1898 when we finally got photographs that they could focus on. They describe it at number 1 as a U between the eyes at the eyebrows. Now, when I look at it, and I'm talking about inside the red circle, it often strikes me as being more of a V than it is a U, but it's always been called a U, and so I'll stay with that. Of course, the number 2 is showing you a line, and we know why that's there, since they rolled the shroud up to store it for apparently 2,000 years. It took on a crease at that point. And so this is picked up in the artwork that comes out in the years after 550 AD. They also pick up at the top 2 lines that are interpreted as hairs. Of course, the reverse 3 is the one from the pain. The nose has a curve enough to it that they believe is injury. The cheek has a bulge that would be injury. And then the fact that the beard seems to be split off center is taken to mean it probably had some of it pulled out. So we could add to this list that we're working on about maybe being hit, falling, about being hit or falling regarding in the cheek, and maybe being abused by the scourgers because there's a chunk of the beard apparently seems to be missing. 1898 was a critical year because there a lawyer by the name of Segundo Pia took the first photograph of the shroud. They were having an exhibition, and it's a huge camera. He focused on the face. He took his picture, and he was greatly surprised by what he got. Now, we see a typical positive, even though you and I are used to thinking in terms of color, we can interpret a black and white without much trouble in positive, but it's in a negative form. It gets a lot harder for us to mentally figure out what we see. Just take example here. The eye on the left is no big problem for you to realize that that's an eye and so forth, but on the right, the interpretation is a lot harder. Well, this comes up when he takes his photograph. This is what he's seeing in front of him with the invention of lighting. Ooh, something wonderful back then to be able to have lighting available to it. And after he takes his picture and he goes in to develop it, this is what he gets. And he was so shocked by what he received, he describes it always as saying, I almost dropped the plate in my shock of what I was seeing, because he realizes he is seeing an entirely different approach than the interpretations up to that point. His negative is actually a positive. And so, for example, what's always been called the owlish open eyes is now realized to be closed eyes. And of course, this is quite a shock. And as he shows this around, well, lots of things happen. Shroud negative, of course, is being a unique item we can add. For 33 years, Segundo Pia was told, you're lying, you cheated, you faked it, you did something. And so it wasn't until the next exhibition that Giuseppe Enri's photographs proved, yes, it is. It's exactly that when you take photographs. So finally we got to the point, we got the full body. And now the advantage of this is the features start to look more lifelike, and the shroud now can be studied by people, even though it's not on exhibition anymore. Shroud research really gets underway a little bit before 1953 because medical science starts to get into it. Now, background, Galen is a physician to an emperor back between 129 and 199 AD. In the 1300s, his understanding was the understanding of medicine. Even come to the 1500s, a medical textbook has very few body parts, very few notes, but an awful lot of daggers, arrows, and clubs. And a man realized you can't fake a shroud back then because they didn't know what it would take to make a shroud appear the way it would be medically correct. So in 1953, a Doctor at Calvary book is written, and it says that the shroud is fully medically correct. And this is where I started back in 1978 with my reading. And I'd say it's still a very good beginning point, although you can't start for $4.25 anymore. The price is going up just a little bit for the book. They talk about the exactness of the image, the wounds, the blood flows, the clotting, how the clot serum and the cellular mass separate, how the lance would have correctly pierced both heart and pleural cavity, the rigor mortis, the blood flows both alive and oozing after death, shroud man being dead when he's placed in the shroud, the death caused by scourging and crucifixion, dying mainly of asphyxiation when too weak to press down on his nerves in his feet. But they're suggesting that congestive heart failure is a likely contributor as this filling with fluid. There have been, to my knowledge, 24 medical examiners of the shroud from 8 different countries, most of the work being done since 1975. And they're all coming to that same conclusion that it is a genuine thing, follows the science we understand today. My favorite is a guy by the name of Robert Buckland. Buckland was the coroner at Los Angeles who did autopsies. And he wrote a 3-page autopsy, which is still on the internet today. Just put in Robert Buckland, autopsy Shroud of Turin, and it pops up. He's the person who was the basis of the Quincy TV show, the one where they always started out with the police officers standing around the autopsy table and then ready to puke, faint or whatever, as he got into his work with the corpse. So we could add to our conclusions about the features being medically correct, but the information not available until at least 1850. There are 125 marks on the body, and we've previously said they're the marks of the Roman scourging. The dots are blinking because they think the people who are whipping were of 2 different heights. The Hebrew limit in lashes was 40. Now they believed when you hit 40, you would kill a person. So the Pharisees made the Hebrews stop at 39. You could never lash more than 39. Well, the Romans didn't have a limit. But Christians generally, as they understand what happened to Jesus, they assume a 39 limit because of the general practice of the Pharisees. Well, I have a theory, and this isn't published, but my theory is when I looked all over the body, it looked like the marks appeared in 2s and 3s. And if you gave 25 lashes with 3 and 25 lashes with 2s, you got your 125 accounted for. That would also explain why Jesus died so soon. The Pilate was very surprised in that he would have been whipped extra. Just a thought. So we'll put on there 2 whippers of different heights. The whipping was done by the Romans who had no limit on stripes. This slide isn't terribly important, except these slides are trying to clarify that with a cloth, you're trying to make sure that the measurements make sense with what we know about anatomy today. And they overall conclude, yeah, it's within normal range, but normal male population. The big issue started in 1976. We had a new instrument called a VP8 image analyzer become available to 3 faculty members at the Air Force Academy, Jackson, Jumper, and Motrin. And I have no idea why they decided to do this, but they took a photograph of the shroud and they put it in the analyzer. And this was their result that they got, which means it's nearer to what we would think of as radar than it is to photography. There's information encoded at each dot, if you will, on the photograph. No other paper photograph has this property. Well, there's some math involved because you've got to figure out, you've got cloth, which is recording the image. And some places, of course, it's touching the body, and some places it isn't. So there's some calculations involved. But what they're showing is that you can, from that, kind of get some sense of depth and so forth. And when I went to visit the Air Force Academy one time, I don't know, 20-some years ago, I went down under the front steps into the chapel, and there stands Shroud. What the professors did was to assign each student a piece of cardboard and a mathematical curve to cut. And they stacked them up in the correct order and spray painted over the thing to make it nice. And there he stands. They also figured out they could take the blood and some of the extra, shall we say, clutter, they could get it off of the image. And so after maybe 6 months or a year, this is what they showed in our journals. One cheek seems to be a lot larger than the other cheek. And you recall from scripture, now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And I show you a pole, and I'll put it close to me so you can get some sense of the size of it. About 1 3/4 inches seems to be the correct size of the pole that would have been used by the Romans at that point. The eyes also seem higher than they would have expected, and we'll find out some information about that a little bit later on. So we put down that the shroud is encoded with 3-dimensional data, which transfers to a photo of the shroud, making an awfully unique photo. Well, that's resulted in science becoming really serious because 1978 was a shroud exhibition year. And they formed a group called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP is what we've been calling it over the years. The second characteristic of science, number 2, is amorality. Now, amorality is not taking a position, of course, based upon a moral basis. It's not breaking a limit like immorality, and it's not remaining within a moral limit like morality. The purpose of this is, of course, to get rid of bias. So when they collected their team to go to Turin to do the research, they made sure they had Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and agnostics. They made sure they had some who thought it was authentic and some who thought it was a forgery. They wouldn't take any money from governments, foundations, churches, or employers. They were trying to see if they could offset all the bias. And that is one of the significant ways that science deals with the problem that you and I both have a big bias about the things we think we see and hear and do. They had 41 scientists when it was all over. They had 120 hours available, and that was clock, 24 hours a day, clock. no time at night, so they were scheduled around the clock. And they rolled their 72 equipment crates in, and they were allowed to do their stuff for 120 hours. They had to give time to some European scientists, which turned out to be really good because some of them had some better ideas. They couldn't do anything destructive, but they were allowed to take pollen off that they could collect and take a few fiber samples. And that turns out to be real important later on. Characteristic number 3, open to any possibility, but demanding evidence. Now, I'll show you an example of someone that would not make a great scientist. This is a retired clergy. And he makes the comment, I don't think anyone, anywhere, at any time brings dead people back to life. That person is not going to make a great scientist. He's already closed his mind off. It's already over. It's a done deal. Nothing's going to convince him. I would suggest a scientist would be more like C.S. Lewis's approach, which is if you want to see a miracle, you have to believe that there's at least a possibility of a miracle. You're open to it. Now, you can demand all the proof you want, but you at least have to be willing to accept the possibility. I've been reading the past month about some Romanian children that many years ago were put into orphanages without care in Romania. They were deemed to be the ones that weren't worth salvaging, if you will. They fed them, they kept them clean enough, if you will, but not because they needed at any particular point. We're now talking about these being, say, 30 years old, 35 years old. Some of them were later adopted. But to me, the interesting reason that I bring it here, only 20% of them who got adopted, even as adults, can believe they're loved. It's beyond their conception, no matter what the family has done for them or made available to them. They just can't picture this as being a possibility. It's as if in the early years of a child's life, if certain things don't happen, it just becomes impossible to accept it. Well, in this being open to any possibility, but demanding evidence, of course, that's where we establish our definitions, working definitions. We've already done that in the sense of saying the word encoding, whatever it was that makes this shroud receive images that we can detect. And I've been using the word shroud man for whomever would happen to be in that piece of cloth, trying to make sure I don't start automatically throwing Jesus into it. We then start working on describing the subject matter fully, but not interpretively. We've already talked about that issue. And so here come all the kinds of things they did to the shroud. They couldn't destroy it, but they could certainly work it over in a variety of ways. Now, I have to be the first to tell you, a lot of these things I don't understand. I would be happy to, I suppose, be happy to have Ken and Bob explain a lot of these things to me, because I don't know what they're. But on the other hand, maybe they don't really think I need to know that either. I have to admit, I rush to conclusions a lot of times at the end of the paper rather than reading a whole lot and trying to figure out what did that paper try to do. And maybe a lot of people would do that too. In what they did, their key aim was to figure out, was it a painting or not? And as it turned out, that was probably not the greatest approach, because once they figured out it wasn't a painting, they were struggling with what to do next as the test. They didn't figure out enough options to have available in 120 hours. And so they found themselves sitting around at times struggling with, okay, well then what should we do? What should we test with the equipment that we have available? They did determine that the method of manufacturing was old as opposed to more recent spinning wheel systems. They did all kinds of color setups, and these turned out to be very important in 2005 when they figured out about the problem with the carbon-14 testing. They did all kinds of contrasting. Characteristic number 4 is an odd one, but I put this in front of you to kind of get an idea. If scientists are working and they come up with a fact that doesn't attach to existing science, they really don't know exactly yet what to do with it. That doesn't mean they throw it away, but it means they're struggling because it doesn't fit. So characteristic number 4 is connecting seemingly unrelated facts and across disciplines. Because we are in a manner of doing building blocks, putting things together. And so while the brown one is not a target, the light green one would be the target. We know what to do with that. That fits. And of course, as we describe things, we often review the literature and see how this fits in with the things we already know. Major breakthroughs, of course, come by connecting seemingly unrelated things, and especially if we can do it across disciplines. So the yellow is wonderful. We've tied things here in many different ways, and we understand a lot better yellow and how to go with that. But the brown, they're not a target, but we'll kind of park that finding and see if we can figure out something to do with it in the future. When the sense of, you can see here the connections, these are the kinds of people they took with them to Italy. In the physics area, they had a PhD with a national reputation in every one of those redwoods. In the chemical area, they had a PhD nationally known in all these areas. In biology, they had all these PhDs because they realized when they got there with 120 hours, they didn't have time to look up anything in journals. They would have to have someone who was on the top of their game at that point. And they were then trying to figure out, what do we have now that we see this stuff? So they back up their truckload, literally a truckload of crates to go in. And there, after the exhibition is over, they have built a special table. The shroud is brought into them, into the room, and they are here spreading out the cloth onto the examination table, which turns and rotates and does a variety of things. Now, I don't know about you, but I'll have some fun at this point. Have you ever heard of 6 degrees of separation? I figure you have somewhere along the way. That the idea is if everyone knows about 44 people, and it doesn't have to be your friends, but if you know about 44 people, then you'd be average. The theory is that in 6 connections, you would include everyone on the earth. And the reason I ask that is, how far away are you from Jesus? You see, if you shake my hand, I've touched the table that touched the cloth that touched the man. Just an interesting way. And of course, with high school students, especially in the Bible Belt, I got a lot of handshakes at the end of a presentation, needless to say. Well, after they got the thing on the table, they did a partial view of the back of the shroud, and they didn't see anything. The back wasn't fully seen until 2002. And that's, in other words, in 2002, they realized there's some image on the back of it that we didn't realize in 1978. They did a lot of transmitted light photography. And there you're looking at one end of it. Now, you can see in the green circle where the fluids have come out onto the cloth. You can see in the yellow circle where it has double layers. This is where the poor Clare nuns put patches over the burns that had happened. You can see down at the blood flow. Whoa. I need to put an L in blood, don't I? You can see in the green circle, you can see the arms and the blood flow that's on the arms. And you can see down here the stains of the water from being folded in such a way in the storage jug that it got a little bit of moisture on it. But right down the middle, you don't see anything. And that means there's no paint on it. And that means a whole bunch of the Shroud investigators realized they had a real puzzle. The artwork answer they were expecting had gone away. So, characteristic of science number 5, conditions and denying part of the world. Scientists have to develop their data under a set of conditions. So, as an example, if you're working on snow, you might want to assume the current jet stream applies because the jet stream moves. So, yeah, makes sense. And the other element is to deny, not to ignore, but to deny that certain things are relevant to whatever it is you're doing. So if you're working on a snow model, you might want to deny that Friday itself happens to be critical. Now, as it turns out, that isn't a true item that can be denied. Not because the word Friday, but because our work week is such that we build up air pollution during the work week. And so Friday does make a difference. Sometimes what you think you can deny doesn't necessarily work out to be true. But anyway, these are examples. Well, with the Shroud, the condition they set was no miracles occurred, which, of course, you can understand that. And with the Shroud, on something they could deny, not ignoring it, but they could deny, was scattered iron oxide. Why would they do that? Well, for years, painters, in making a copy of something, have, after it's over, touched the copy to the original in order to, in their understanding, get some of the power of the original to their copy. And knowing this, they knew that scattered iron oxide would occur. Here are the known Shroud contaminants plus 5 probable contaminants as well. And you can see one of them is oxides and paints. They knew that would happen. But you can see soaps and oils and wounds and rust, and it's on and on and on. Well, just as soon as they got back from Italy, Walter Macron published that it was a fake. Clearly, it was after 1300 because he found iron oxide. He did not fulfill this requirement of the scattered iron oxide. He saw a little bit, and that for him was sufficient. And for many people, that was the end of the story. Of course, he could just as easily have said it was after 1920 because we found scattered nylon threads on it as well. Or he could have said just as easily it's after 1800 because there was scattered fly ash on the Shroud too from the power station. They did microscopic evaluations. They did cut a few threads, which became really important later on. They did wet chemistry testing. They tried to figure out if there's any dyes or stains involved. They tried to see if they could extract the yellow color. They couldn't bleach out the yellow color. They worked some at the fibril level. They figured out that there are lumps of myrrh and aloes and so forth. They figured out it was non-directional. They had instruments to help them figure out where did it come from, and they couldn't find out any way that someone had like spray painted or painted in any form. They came up, no detection of angles. So they concluded it was not made by human hand or by machine. If you look at the chest, you can, of course, at 32 magnifications, you can see the blood. If you come to the right eye at 32, you get a real good example there of just how light. You can see the brown with a lot of white. or 64 magnification on the nose, it's even more obvious. It's like it's just touching the topmost part of a thread. Now, it seems to be a corrosion is what's going on, but it's only limited to the outermost fibrils. And they said maybe 2 to 5 fibrils was the amount that was touched out of 80 to 100 that would be in a thread. Now, excuse my effort here, but this took a while for me to make up all these little circles, but I thought maybe this would help. Imagine yourself looking at the end of a thread, which might have 80 or 120. I didn't go that far. And what they're saying is the topmost image comes from just a few of the thread. And in 1978, this was their understanding. Was it turned out, 2002, in some places, we found an image on the backside with all the fibrils in the middle are white, which makes it even harder to interpret and figure out how to make some hypothesis to test. So we'll have the image is encoded by corrosion of the most minute amount of thread fiber only. In 1980, they finally had dealt with the blood question, blood type AB. The blood is very red. And of course, some people immediately respond, oh, then it had to be fake. Well, with studies, they realized that in extreme pain situations, blood, because of the bilirubin change, remains permanently much more red than usual. Two gentlemen by the name of Adler and Heller studied the blood in great detail. They had a great deal of trouble doing it because they said usually when they do crime scenes, there's lots of blood. They said this was a lot tougher because it was very hard to come up with enough blood to test. But they finally did their work, and they finally established all 12 of the tests that are typically done. And 3 of the 12, any 3 of the 12, is sufficient in a US court to prove whole blood. Garza Valdez in 2001 had isolated 750 pairs of DNA. Now, of course, we have billions of pairs in a human, but he had been able to isolate chromosome 11, chromosome X, and chromosome Y. And then, one of my favorites, they tried to figure out how long between the point of death and the point that the body had to be in the shroud based upon the clots that they're seeing. And they end up saying 2.5 hours. The body had to be post-death put in the shroud. And then the question arises about removing the body without breaking the blood clots. And of course, the result is, they said, that's impossible. That's an interesting word choice, impossible. Well, they describe it. They're trying to say that, imagine on your arm, you've got a wound. You are bleeding. You put some type of gauze over it, and you let everything dry. Now try to remove the gauze without allowing anything to show evidence that the gauze was present. And they say it's impossible to do it without being detectable. So we'll put on type AB blood, minimal chromosome data. 2.5 hours he had to be in the shroud. And somehow he left the shroud by a manner that they call impossible. That's a fun kind of word to think about. All right. Characteristic of science number 6, proceed by elimination of alternatives. Science doesn't directly develop an evidence of a theory, but rather considers all the alternatives and rejects the ones that won't work. And hopefully you end up with the one that will work, but you're also leaving yourself open to the possibility there's an alternative you haven't even thought of yet. So over the years, and we're talking about many, many years here, a whole bunch of hypotheses have been tried. You see a model, and here's 3 examples have been tried against it. But they've tried putting all kinds of ointments on a body, if you will, a model. They've tried to heat it, so forth. And the outcome of it all is that they've made up 10 hypotheses, and we, at this point, have rejected all of them. They can't figure out a way by photography to do it, or putting compounds on it, or scorching it, or draping it in some manner, or using stuff we use for funerals. And over the years, a whole bunch of books have been written on these various ones. So I don't want to put these people down who've tried. They certainly have been intent trying to come up with possibilities. Now, I've underlined the word complete in the sense that they are trying to say that hypothesis would account for pretty much everything we see on the Shroud. As we're going to see later on, we're at the point of talking about partial theories now, that maybe it takes 2 or maybe it takes 3 to explain all the things that we're seeing. The struggle with these, going past these 10, is that the possibility of a miracle might be involved. And of course, we've already said we're taking the condition of a non-miracle situation. So science of 1978, clear up to now, has hypothesized only 10 explanations, and it's ended up rejecting them all. Adding to their concern is that there are some X-rays of bones both below and bones above. You see the hands, and I'll take this away, but can you see below lines going? And also they think this is the wound in the other wrist. There's also on the spine in the back, there's the same kind of thing, that they can see bones. So what would some new hypothesis cover? So here's where they're kind of stuck. Whatever it is, it has to be a photographic negative. It's got to have 3-dimensional, kind of like radar information. It's got to encode not only those X-rays, the skin, the wounds, and all those good things, but also we're going to see flowers and coins before we're done. It's got to encode wherever the cloth touches the body, but a guy has to encode where it doesn't touch the body. It's got to receive any remaining blood clots in some manner. It's got to be non-directional, so it can't be picked up by the directional equipment, but it's got to be totally directional. That is, it has to be totally straight up and straight down, none to the sides, because the encoding has to come from inside the body. You can't use reflected light. There's no traces of lateral body image, although there are lateral body blood stains of various kinds. Whatever happened had to be done in 4 days. And you have this problem of the blood clots. You have to have the body come out of it in what we think is an impossible way. We know that the encoding changed the flex carbon bonds from a single to a double bond. And so one of the better ideas that's been discussed is trying to illustrate here, if the cloth is that red line, somehow as the body does whatever it does, the cloth is coming down collecting information. That allows it to pick up the coding of the X-rays. except that it's a little more complex in that the body has to be dropping slightly when it happens too, to get the spine in the back. So that if the body is 1 through 8, before it gets totally done, it has to be 2 through 7 to pick up 8, which would be the spine. So in 2000 AD, this was the best guess to the encoding. Shroud Man was placed in the Shroud of Turin within 2.5 hours of the death, but was not in the shroud for 4 days because there's no evidence of decomposition, and was dematerialized so that no blood clot break occurred, allowing both the body and the shroud to drop because of the slight vacuum that they see with the cloth moving outward on the sides, allowing data to be encoded from bones on both sides of the body. This involves intense heat, gamma, alpha rays maybe, that are only encoded within 2 inches, starting advanced oxidation of 2 to 3 fibrils, that's our image, and added carbon-14 data to the cloth and causing the coins and the flowers encoding by gamma rays. Dematerialize, what is that? Well, Carol and I have chuckled. The best thing we can think of to illustrate is Star Trek. Beam me up, Scotty. Except in this case, you'd put him parallel and you'd have a shroud wrapped around him, which is collapsing. Recording that information when it happened. That's the best mental picture that I've been able to put on this thing. Science didn't have the remotest idea how this would start or how they would even test for it. And that was before 2002, because then we've realized there's image on the backside of the shroud. So the center of the thread is white, but you've got this little bit of brown appearing on both sides of the thread. Wow. Dematerialization is the closest conceptualization that seems to account for the data at that point. Okay, we come to one of the fun ones. I like this one. Ken, I don't know about you, but if you like statistics, you'll love this one too. Characteristics of science number 7, probability and error measurement. Science tries to figure out what is a measurement of its likely range of mistake if it makes a mistake. So here you have 18 inches plus, and it gives a little bit of variation, and then we think the answer is within that. And so we talk about confidence levels of less than 1%. You undoubtedly heard polling error of less than 3%. They're trying to give you some idea how much. Of course, the politicians are hoping that it's the difference between candidate A and candidate B is a whole lot greater than the polling error, so they feel a lot more comfortable with the answer they're seeing. And the science journals publish articles when the mistake chance is less than 1 in 20, or a confidence interval is less than 0.05. And all science and statistics use this 1 in 20 as a strong basis for deciding what we publish and what we go with and what we understand. So, phrasing it this way, if we conservatively consider the odds of just number of factors, so we can talk about thorns or the unbroken legs or something, the odds are 1 in what? That this is not Jesus's authentic shroud. And so you get to think about what are the factors you'd like to take into account, and what do you think that would mean? So just for funsies, you could think about, if we had a room full of people, I could even have you put up your hands at this point. What do you think the chances are that this is authentic? 1 in 18, almost good enough to publish? Or 1 in 20, we could publish that. Or when I was a kid in statistics back before computers, if you got 1 in 100, you felt pretty darn good. Things are going the way you want. Or it could even be higher. Yeah. You think about what your answer is. 7 factors. 2 guys published that there's only 1 chance in 225 billion that this is not Jesus' authentic shroud. And the way they said for you to visualize it is to say that we're going to randomly fill Texas 2 feet deep with silver dollars. And we're going to hire a company to put 1 painted silver dollar into that stack sometime. They could put it in the beginning. They could put it in during the filling process. They could drop it on after it's all over. Their choice. And then you send a blindfolded person out and say, you go out there and you pick up 1 silver dollar. And if you pick up the red one, you can see what they're talking about. This is amazing. Other people have done other calculations. Some of them higher, as you can see. Now, how'd they go about this? Well, you can see here, Stevenson and Habermas in 1981, they picked 8 factors that they thought were important. And they said 1 and 2, 1 in 400, 1 and 2, 1 and 3. And so they set up what they thought the odds were. And of course, they're going to multiply them together, and they came up with 82, 1 in 82 million. They ignored other possibilities. There's a reason for that, but you can see the number could be higher. You could also see that they could change this number by changing the crown, not just 1 in 400. Why not 1 in 1,000? No other crowns are known. Or down under the one about the criminal in a superb linen, 1 in 8. Why not 1 in 1,000? There are only 3 burials known in the world. Or no decay instead of 1 in 100. Why not 1? There's no non-decay known. And you could also add predictions and other science, non-science things to it. So you could make this number big. Now, that's where the question comes up. Can you fudge the probability? Yes. If you have a large number of factors, or if you have very high odds to multiply, you can certainly make that number go up. So the scientists are reasonably trying to keep it down to smaller factors and smaller multiplications. I thought one of the best answers I heard in the whole deal. They asked one guy what he thought the probability was, and he told, you pick a number and I'll agree to it. And just put it back on them. You know, I know it's over 1 in 100. It's way up there. I have no idea. You can pick anything and it'll be fine. A new thing came out in the year 2000, done by 2 Italians. And I have to admit, my statistics does not cover this. I came out of the old school where we did things by hand. It's a probabilistic model that they applied, and they took the 100 most significant findings, both pro and con. And they included Macron's opinion that the blood was pink. They took carbon-14 just as it was reported years ago. They have in it the confession, which we now know is false. They had all these things that worked out in the 100. They loaded all this into a computer software. They had 3 alternatives. It could be authentically Jesus of Nazareth. It could be a medieval fake, which would go with the carbon-14 date. Or it could include something else, but not Jesus of Nazareth. And the results that they got out of it was authentic, 100%. And the way they explained it, thankfully, for a layperson like myself was to say there was a greater chance of getting the same number on a roulette wheel 52 times straight than the Shroud of Turin was not authentic. Wow, that was quite something. So the conclusion as of 2020, with almost 400,000 scientist hours, and you see all the other kinds of people that are not included in that number, I think is well rounded up in what John Heller said. If you gave me a budget of $10 million and told me to make a replica, I wouldn't know how to do it. We're in the neighborhood of around 4.6 million hours of research, making it the most studied object in science and otherwise in history. So the statistical chances of this not being the burial cloth of Jesus is essentially zero. But of course, that's going to include some information we're yet to talk about. Despite being the most studied object by science, we still don't know how to frame some hypothesis to test it. So after 1978, we have some science materials to look at. And that will include flowers, pollen, coins, which will give us some clues, art, which will give us some clues, wood, soil, and coins on the eyes. One of my favorites happens to be that the 28 flower images are on the shroud. Obviously, they're microscopic. They're fresh in March and April in Jerusalem. And about half of them don't grow in Europe, so that helps to narrow down the place. I'm going to show you where it is with the red lines and then take them away. Can you see the example? Obviously, I can't hear whether you did or you couldn't. I'll go back. I'll do it one more time just to be sure. Okay. One of the flowers grows only in Israel, Jordan, and Sinai. That helps narrow down the place. And one of my favorites happens to be this flower. It begins opening at noon. It's fully open by 5:30. So they can determine that the shroud flower was picked between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. That to me is amazing. And if that's not amazing enough, the encoded images most closely match flowers after 24 to 36 hours of wilting. So the encoding happened after 3 p.m. on day 2, but before 4 a.m. on day 3. Wow. Pollen. Max Free was a Swiss criminologist. He was not part of the Scourge team. He's the one who did pollen because the Scourge equipment didn't do what they thought it would do, but his technique worked. And he identified 58 pollen that happens to be on the shroud. You can see I'm going to use I and F for Italy and France to weed out some things here. Adding it up, 45 of the 58 pollen occur in Palestine. 2 occur in Odessa, Turkey. 6 are on further up in Turkey. 1 is exclusively in Constantinople. And 4 occur in France and Italy to make the 58. If you take a map and you mark on it the ones with the blinking yellows, so you can see where they seem to come from, you can see the winds are such that it's not likely that you could have blown the pollen from one place to another and gotten it down to the green arrow, which is, of course, at Jerusalem. But most of this stuff is insect pollinated anyhow, so it wouldn't reach. The flax is soaked in ponds, they call them the retting process. And that gives the opportunity for pollen to get onto the cloth. And since this cloth is a superb one, it would have to soak longer, so it certainly would be able to have a whole lot more pollen. When we come to art, this was work that was done for some time where they're trying to see, was the image of the shroud being the one used in artwork? And a lot was done here with all kinds of images against the art that's been done in churches and, of course, paintings as well. With coins, they worked with the solidus. The solidus was the coin that was used to pay soldiers. In fact, we get our word soldier from the word solidus. And in 692, you see the coin that suddenly became the standard with the face that came from the shroud. So apparently in the neighborhood of 650 or somewhere through there, we had all the conditions of people knowing about the face and being in power enough to start using it on coins. Here's an example, one over the other. The Wangers, Alan and Mary Wanger, were at Duke University, and they found 145 congruences. 14 congruences will carry conviction of U.S. court, to give you some kind of a basis, and 105 congruences with another coin. They were handmade, so you expect some incongruences, of course. Lots of techniques apply. With the wood, it's believed that only the crossbar was carried, that it's not the whole cross as we often have it in our paintings, and that at the point of the crucifixion itself, the nailing would have happened, and then it would be somehow put on a post that would be permanently left in place. The guess is that the hands were tied in the crossing, the carrying process, but then the nailing happened at the site. There are wood tubules that were found at the back of the head, and they were of oak. And that, of course, was the most common wood in Palestine at the time. This also means, as you can see this picture, that if the person fell, they did not have much protection for their face, as would be later apparent. There are two spots on the shroud. The left contact area is 5.5 inches, and the right excoriated skin area is more of a rectangle. The geology that they studied, Jerusalem is at the edge of several geology types, several water types, and several vegetation types. And on the soil on the knee, the heel, and the nose, they're interpreting that as being fall or falls. And the kind of soil they found was travertine aragonite. Travertine calcite is more likely to be found. The aragonite is basically found only within 10 kilometers of Jerusalem, and a very few limited other set of places. So it would be a good bet that it was there. It's heavier on the knees than the feet. So they're interpreting that would make sense, that it hitting it as a fall would make sense. The limestone throughout the shroud matches exactly both of the places that claim to be the correct tomb. So it doesn't answer that question for anyone if they're trying to use the shroud to answer the question of where was the correct tomb. We talked about coins on the eyes the eyes seem too high. This comes up again in the dealing with the coins. When they look at the cheek and the rim, they think there's injuries around it. And so they did digital overlays with the DP8 images to see if they coincide. 14 points of congruence of the yellow with the brown was what you're looking for to prove something in a U.S. court. And the Wangers claimed 211 points and 86 of discordance. In 29 AD, the coins, of course, made by hand, so there was always some variation. If you think on the right eye, we have the pilot lepton coin, which was made in 29 through 34 AD. The right eye, I'm sorry, the left eye, I always have to get myself right and left sorted out here. We have, they think, the Julia coin. There were 73 congruences. That part was good, but an awful lot of discordance was seen. And it's a lepton symbol there. This particular coin was struck only in 29 AD in memory of Caesar's mother, who died that year. And as they looked around, they can't find anything else that remotely comes close. The coins only circulated during the reign of a specific ruler. So in 39 AD, all the coins of the existing Herod had to be withdrawn. And whether you remember that Jesus was asked a question during what we call Holy Week about, do you pay your taxes, in effect? And he says, render unto Caesar the things that belong to Caesar. Well, he was absolutely correct, because coins were thought to belong to Caesar. And so when Caesar died, all coins came back in and were melted down and reissued with the new ruler. Obviously, that wiped a lot of coins out, except if they used them on the eyes of dead people, in which case they did survive. Now, the Greeks put them in the mouth of the dead person. The Jews put them on the eyes of the dead person. And you can tell the difference because of where the coins drop when the body disintegrates, whether it's in the skull or below the skull. The coins only circulated then. This would, of course, mean that Shroud men had to enter the tomb between 29 and 34 AD. The significance of 29, well, our calendar is off, and we think that 0 should actually be about 4 BC. In 4 BC, we have a very large Halley's Comet, right? Appears twice and moving. Sound familiar with the story in the Bible? And of course, 29 AD would be 33 years after 4 BC. Now, you may wonder why this blinking question mark, and that's a fair question. Back up 15 years ago, 25 years ago, I wouldn't have had the blink. Once in 2002, they redid the Shroud, as we'll talk about later. It's a little bit longer than it was, which means that some of the things that have been the basis of the coins on the eye study don't line up the same way. It's distorted what we had seen in the eyes. They're a little bit longer. In other words, I can't replicate today the exact same thing that was seen before. So this is a good question as to whether we should still stay with this idea of the years or not. At any rate, the coins were before 700 AD. The wood, the soil. So we can make this potential conclusion. Combining all the information, in Jerusalem, someone picked 28 flowers sometime between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, in March or April, maybe 29 or 29 through 34, placed them in the shroud before 5:30 p.m., and they were encoded within 24 to 36 hours. And combining again the information, science could establish then the Shroud is fully authentic, Jewish, probably at the city of Jerusalem from the time of Jesus of Nazareth, from a crucifixion victim who matches the information given in the New Testament. And the chance of this not being the Shroud of Jesus is about as near to zero as anything we could expect to find. How's that for a good place to wrap up for the evening? That's, of course, science. Not that we're done with science yet, but after 2 days of it, we've covered an awful lot. And we haven't gotten around to what the history and the findings will be there. And we haven't talked in any manner about what the possibilities are with Scripture.